Hi, welcome to our first podcast where the Highline School District librarians discuss digital media literacy. So I'm Mrs. Meschter, librarian at Chinook.
I'm Mrs. McSheehy. I'm from Evergreen High School.
I'm Miss SL. I'm from Sylvester Middle.
And I'm Miss Gunn. I'm at Highline High School.
So today, let's define some of these terms. Like we in Highline know that we have a strategic promise tied to digital literacy and media literacy. And we hear the terms digital literacy, digital citizenship, news literacy, media literacy, all kind of jumbled together. So what are these terms? What do they even mean? So do we want to start with like discussing what is digital citizenship?
Sure.
Okay. So when you hear the term digital citizenship, or when you're asked to teach digital citizenship, how is it defined for you?
Well, something that most people automatically think about is cyberbullying. Mm-hmm. So it's how we interact with people online, that kind of personal responsibility. Mm-hmm. But I think that it goes beyond just that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are components of digital citizenship that are around safety for sure, and not just like bullying kinds of issues, but like your own personal privacy and like how are you sharing information? Who do you know who you're sharing information with? Mm-hmm. Passwords and having secure passwords, like all of those kinds of things are in that sort of safety category. Mm-hmm. But there's definitely other components in digital citizenship as well.
Yeah, and just focusing on that second word, citizenship, is a great place for everybody to start wrapping their minds around what digital citizenship is, because what are the things that we need to be good citizens or to feel like we're part of, a citizenship in our society. And it's safety, it's respect, it's proper channels of communication, it's making sure that, you can proceed into this other world, the digital world, mm-hmm. in a space that's that you feel relatively protected and your rights are protected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think in some ways, like looking at the four terms that you have up behind you, Ms. Meschter, like maybe you guys will not agree with this, but I kind of feel like digital citizenship on some level is like a big header, and some of those other more specific literacies sort of fall within that. I think people could probably argue that it's like the reverse of that, but I feel like couched within digital citizenship is also that critical thinking piece about yes. what you are seeing in the digital world or in news media or other types of media, as well as thinking critically about what you are putting out there in the world. And I think sometimes I know I have a tendency to focus with students about the like evaluating the incoming information, right. And I spend less time with them thinking about the output of information, yep. Which I think is a flaw in my plan.
I agree.
So I think that, yeah, and that brings up the point about students' digital footprint, mm-hmm. that what they're creating, what they're putting out there is part of that digital citizenship bubble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm glad, Ms. McSheehy and Ms. Gunn, that you brought that up, because I was talking about our expectations of safety as citizens, but we have expectations and responsibilities from ourselves toward others too, mm-hmm. and that is part of that. What are you contributing to this online community, and what impact is it having on others?
Mm-hmm. I think about digital citizenship about how we act online as a learner, a creator, and a participant. And I think that's where digital literacy, media literacy, and news literacy all are buckets within that. Like it's our behavior, both receiving and putting information out there. So I think we tend to focus on like cyberbullying or digital safety just because it's an easy bucket to check, right? but it also encompasses like our attitudes towards things online. And like, that's a harder, how do you evaluate somebody's attitude, right? Like that's a harder check mark.
Well, I think that's why it ties in so well with the cell learning that we're doing in schools, because, you know, and this is a huge problem with having any kind of digital presence, is that disinhibition effect, where you feel like there's this cyber wall between you and real people, and what you say and put out in the world, it's not the same, but you're really communicating with people. It's a communication tool in some way, and you have to use it responsibly. So, kind of emphasizing that social and emotional learning part of what digital citizenship entails is really important.
Well, and I think, Ms. Meschter, I've heard you say this more than once earlier today, but also last year, the idea of like, what if we just removed the word digital from digital citizenship and thought about like, how do we monitor ourselves or like teach young people, like, what is it like to participate in a community? And those same things that we talk about when we're talking about a in-person community or a physical community, like those same things apply online. And it's easy to forget that those things apply when it's easy to be faceless online, right? And so, people make that comparison of like, what would you say to somebody face to face versus what would you say when you're anonymous online, right? So how do we like make it really clear that we're not talking about a different set of rules for the digital world, really, right? We're talking about applying the things that we already believe are important in the real world to the digital setting.
Right.
Yeah. And if anything, Ms. Gunn, I would say it's applying those things and being even more vigilant because of some of the sort of removal that you may feel because you're in a digital environment. You guys were talking, and I was thinking about being in kindergarten 1,000 years ago, and we actually used to receive good citizenship awards. And I know that's way too young for our students, but just appreciating what it means to be a good citizen online and offline is something that we need to get back to.
Right. Like we know not to hit our neighbor, right? But I think we do a digital version of that, like when we get into flame wars or trolling. But I think that's where it's easy to focus on like our behavior or our, like this check mark. If I just do this good thing, but there's so many, it is a big hat. And I think that's where there's some overlap between digital literacy and media literacy and news literacy. So what is digital literacy?
I'm super curious actually to hear what you guys have to say about this, because to be perfectly honest, I feel like these distinctions are things that I struggle with a little bit. So I'm going to answer for myself, and you can tell me if you think I'm wrong. But I feel like digital literacy is probably a bigger pot than media or news literacy. So like digital literacy maybe is not just about like information, but it's also like my understanding of the technology related to the tools versus just content.
Right. Agreed. So like there's some like tech flexibility. The American Library Association, so as librarians, we tend to pay attention to that definition. They define digital literacy as the ability to use information and communication technology in order to find, evaluate, create, and communicate using cognitive and technical skills. So it's a big term, but it's find and use information to evaluate, create, and communicate information. So just like print literacy.
And I think what you brought up, Kirsten, about there's the tech skills that you need, how to navigate, basic understandings about technology and how it works, but also those critical thinking skills about, evaluating and also creating, like, understanding the different tools and when to use them appropriately for whatever your goal is.
Yeah, I think when we as teachers are allowing multiple pathways for students to demonstrate knowledge, we allow students to demonstrate their digital literacy. So it's also good educational practice, like having choice, right? Like and spacing on the term, but like allowing choice. What?
UDL?
UDL, Universal Design for Learning.
Universal Design for Learning.
It's also good like digital literacy practice. Like when we tell students this is our target outcome, you have tools at your disposal. Students have the ability to be creative, to show what they know, to find something new, to introduce us to something new. And the tech world and the digital world is changing all the time, right? So the things that were really awesome tools like 5 years ago might not be the right tool now.
Right. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's been a big sticking point for me, Ms. Meschter, that, you know, we focus a lot on what hasn't been working about in distance learning, but I think in a weird way, it's forced a lot of educators out of their comfort zone to accept the fact that we all need literacy in all of these technology tools, and they are constantly changing. So literacy isn't like, I now know how to use Padlet, I will use Padlet forever. It's, I know how to use Padlet, I can use it well now, and what's the next tool? It's not static at all. There's a constant change. And this is what helps us with differentiation. This is what helps us with, you know, modification. This is what helps our students with different forms of expression. And that's the world we live in, and that's the world they're going to lead. So we have to be comfortable with, even if it's not with technology in general, we have to be comfortable with the idea that technology is an important part of our lives, and digital literacy is all about that. And I'll get off my soapbox now. But I know you're all in the soapbox with me.
Well, and I think that's an interesting thing. I've started to talk with some teachers about, you know, like, I think definitely we have made, like if you think about technology integration in education, right? Like we were forced to do that in the last year. So then I think the interesting thing will be, once distance learning is, like once we're back in in-person school, like how do we hang on to the technology tools that are really useful and can have a good benefit for teachers and students, while also being like, hey, we've been on screens pretty much nonstop for the last year. Like, let's all take a step back from that as well, right? And that's you know, back to digital citizenship, that's media balance, right? Is a component of that. And I think all of us have maybe been out of balance when it comes to media, just out of necessity for the last year. And so I'll be interested to see how we as educators and how our students feel about, like, let's take a step back, let's hang on to the good things, but like maybe also take a bit of a breath as well.
Right. So speaking of media balance, let's discuss media literacy. So I think media literacy and news literacy, like honestly, I heard the term news literacy for the first time in December, and I was like, oh, but this is what stuff I already know how to do. Why did I not know this term before? And I spent a lot of time educating myself about media literacy and trying to stay as current as possible. So media literacy and news literacy, can we discuss those at the same time? And what are they?
I would love somebody to tell me the difference, because honestly, I see those terms and I would lump them together. So I'd be curious to know what the distinction, or if, like, again, I like to think in sort of categories, right? So if digital literacy is a bigger category, then like media literacy is the next big category, and then news literacy is a subcategory. Like, that's how I would think of it.
That's how I think of it. Joanne?
And I think that's a good way to think of it. I mean, okay, I'm going to do this thing again that I did with citizenship. Literacy. All right, librarians, we're always tied to the word literacy, and we should be, but people erroneously think literacy just means reading, and you can have financial literacy, and you can have health literacy, and you can have news literacy, and media literacy is kind of a bigger bucket, because media is what we use to get news, but media is also what we generally use to get and disseminate information, any kind of medium. So, it must be the Latin student in me taking a look at the roots of these things. The literacy part is about, entrenching yourself in all of it. Do you know how to do it? Do you know what it is? Do you know what it's used for? Do you know how to navigate all the intricacies of it? And I know that's very broad because I'm just talking in broad terms, but media literacy is that focused on media. I mean, that's how I see it. And it's that focused on news, which media plays a role in. I'm sorry, Miss McSheehy. Do you want to add stuff?
Well, I think that, I agree with what you're saying about news is part of media literacy. I think that media literacy needs to take into account all forms of media, whether that be print or digital, and also encompasses creating media. And also creating, evaluating, which is also part of news literacy. But I think of news literacy as more judging, and looking at the reliability of news, and the messages, and media is more of a general critique, but also of all types of media.
Yeah. No, and I think news literacy, though it's part of media literacy, news literacy is in the spotlight, particularly now. And I hate to sort of bring the elephant into the room, because we've heard fake news tossed around for a few years now, and that's really muddied the waters of what our expectations from news should be, what we need to be looking for to make sure that we're getting news that involves like the ethical treatment of information and the ethical use of media. So news literacy takes a spotlight because we are dependent on the news to make decisions about everything every day, and that's become a lot trickier for a lot of people. And when you tell people, well, it's there, but you have to work harder for it, I think it sends some people just running in the other direction.
I think also with news media, or news literacy, is the fact versus opinion is a big topic that needs to be addressed. And so I think that would go also with media literacy, because you come across that in all forms of media, not just the news.
Well, and I think, again, how things change in the digital world, right? Like, years ago, you lived in a situation where, like, if you wanted news, you subscribed to a newspaper that was delivered to your house, or you watched the evening news, or you maybe listened to radio news. And there were like specific pathways for getting that kind of information. And that's just changed so much in recent years. And I was in a class recently that was talking about news literacy and disinformation and misinformation. And one of the challenges in our modern era is even understanding like the algorithms at play with, so like how certain things might come across my screen and different things might come across, Kim's screen or your screen, because of our search histories and what like technology knows about us, and like how quickly we can become almost accidentally siloed, right? Not even because of our own choices. So I think there's a really interesting thing specifically in news literacy around like, how does it play into when I am actively seeking out information through search strategies versus when I am passively receiving information through social media or what other networks I might be a part of. And that can look really different, and understanding why it looks different.
Right. And I think news literacy, again, like is a subcomponent of media literacy, but I think that's where when we get to when some people think media literacy, they think about education, about filter bubbles and what is the mainstream media? Just like a basic definition of those things. And I think that actually is more of a news literacy skill, like understanding the role of the news, because media also is your social media, it's your social networking, it's your the catalogs that you receive at home, like what sort of, it's all of that other type of media. And so
media and news, though, you landed on it. They're used interchangeably, and they're not the same thing.
right.
And people think they're the same thing, to the point that we see more and more statistics about like how people are getting their news. And I think it was not the last election, but the one prior to that, the rate of people getting their news through Twitter and Facebook and Instagram was much higher than it had ever been. And
Right.
even in there, we have to get down to separating that medium, or those media being used for news and for all the other things that they can be used for. And that's,
Right.
again, very tricky. It's a skill.
It's a skill. Yeah. So it's a skill that requires a lot of practice and a lot of I think a lot of explicit instruction. I think for a long time, we've just assumed people know how to do this work. But we know from the 2016 election that that's where I think we all became aware of the information silos and information bubbles, like that people were getting completely different Facebook feeds, no matter how carefully you were to try to find out all sorts of information. And then we know in the 2020 election that people become increasingly distrustful of news, and no matter what the news of origin is. And so I think it speaks to how critical it is to explicitly teach those literacy skills, but also how muddied the water is between behavior online and reading online and filtering that information and internalizing it and processing it, right? Like it's just, there's a lot going on. It's a lot of discrete skills.
Yeah. And I think what I did a lesson with some teachers earlier this year, and I asked them to do a pre-session survey, and then we talked about it afterwards. And two of the questions that I asked were like, sort of how important do you think these kinds of skills are? And then how often do you explicitly teach them in your content area? And I had teachers from across different content areas. And, pretty much without fail, folks were saying these are really important. And then not as often as I would like, or not very much was the answer to how often do I teach them in my content area. And so we had a conversation about that. And I think it's a really, because there's so many complex things, I think it's hard to know where to start. And for years, I feel like this is something that we as an entire system need to wrap our collective hearts and minds around, because to say, this 9th grade LA is the place for this, or 10th grade social studies is the place for this. It's too big of a thing to say it's this one department's job, right? But because there are definitely standards that hit on these, there's EdTech standards specifically for this, but they're not necessarily content specific. And so when you're how do we fit them into the different boxes? I think that's a question that I would love our education institutes to wrap our hearts and minds around, to come to something together so that no one person feels like, oh crud, it's my responsibility to do this and I'm not doing it well.
Right.
But that's where we come in. That's why I'm super excited that Highline now has these media literacy standards that they're bringing to the fore, and that they're bringing librarians in, because you're right, they should be taught across all content, because media literacy, digital citizenship is something that you encounter everywhere. It's not subject specific, and we have the flexibility to take what we do into any classroom. And that's what we need. We need to be invited into more of the classrooms, or force our way into more of the classrooms to say, here's how you do it. here's how, this is the perfect opportunity. You're, having them do research on something, or you're having them create something where they're going to communicate a message, or the students are constantly needing these skills. And I don't know, I want us to be like the media literacy warriors out there moving between all the different landscapes, saying, here's a tool you can use, and here's something you should understand.
Well, I've always thought that, and I've said this out loud, that anytime we ask kids to open a computer and click on their internet browser, we should be doing some type of digital literacy every time, or media literacy, or any of those. If that could be a regular practice, whether it's just a quick reminder, it's a tip, a trick, whatever. It doesn't have to be a huge lesson.
I like you reinforcing that, of like, we're not talking about, like, yes, there are lots of things, but they can be divvied up in lots of ways that it can be something that is quick and easy and memorable, without having to spend, 2 weeks learning the whole research process every class.
Yes.
And applicable to what they're doing as they open that internet browser.
Yes.
And I like that approach, Ms. McSheehy, because we often think, oh, they need to be applying skills that they learned through other media, critical thinking skills, to the internet, which is true, but we might actually have to sort of do the reverse now and say, hey, these are skills that maybe they don't have, how to evaluate other media, but hey, we've got the internet in front of them. That's a great place to teach them these skills, and then maybe we can help them learn to apply it to any other kind of information intake and processing that they do in this modern age. I just made myself sound really old. Sorry.
Listen, you need to stop saying that, because I think we're around the same age. Stop.
I just mean physically, I feel older. We're both super young at heart. No, I joke. I just, I think about that, how much has changed since I went to school versus, the students today. And that's another thing to think about, why it's so overwhelming. There has been such an increase in technology use, in technology tools, in the way that we see the world, that it's overwhelming at times. And I always want to be considerate of that, because I think information overload is a real concern. And I also think, going back to what we were talking about earlier, with this digital online distance learning model, is a lot of people who didn't grow up with the rapid change that our students are growing up with. Adapting to that is harder. So maybe, also patience and grace and care need to be worked into every little bit of literacy, media, news, digital or otherwise.
On that note, we should, any final thoughts as we wrap up the conversation? I think we'll go more in depth about these topics later. So any final closing thoughts as we wrap up for the time?
I think the only thing that I would say that I think we would all agree with is just reminding any educator out there that you're not alone, and that there are people in your building, whether it's your librarian or other teachers, or, to seek a community to move forward in this work with, and don't feel like the heavy lift is yours alone. And at the same time, even while feeling overloaded, reminding ourselves that this really is important for our students' futures, and it's worth taking the time and figuring out a way to embed these skills in a variety of ways in our classrooms.
Ditto.
Exactly. exactly. I couldn't say it better. Thank you, Ms. Gunn. That was beautiful.
I was just thinking, we are coming up on the 1-year anniversary of working from home and school from home. And while I have thought that these skills were super important for a long time, I think the pandemic and our school from home has created like a crisis point. Like these have become like so essential, and we're all scrambling, and I'm looking forward to when we can work like I'm excited about the ways that we're able to collaborate digitally. Like this process right here is exciting to me. And there are things that have transformed our education system that I think are here to stay. And I'm excited that we are now having these conversations with a beyond librarian group, right? Like these conversations have become apparent to everybody that we need to be more explicit about teaching all of these skills. So those are my final thoughts. Like it's been a year and we clearly need to do more.
Thank you for organizing this. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank you.